Hello everyone, it's another Monday, and I think we all know what that means by now. That means another episode of the Earful Tower, which is brought to you by French Today. Now they're audiobooks that'll teach you French. You'll be able to speak like a native, and you can get a 10% discount if you go frenchtoday.com/earful5, but more about them at the end of the episode. If you're new around here and you're wondering what the heck is the Earful Tower, well, it's a podcast hosted by me. My name's Oliver G. I'm an Australian guy that lives in Paris. And typically, I tackle France. I try and find the people that are helping the City of Light to shine. Whether that's a mayor or a chef or an author or a blogger or a YouTuber. Just someone interesting to talk to about Paris and what's so good about it. So if you're expecting that here on your first episode of The Earful, I'm sorry to let you down. That's not what's going to happen this week because I've been on holiday in... well, I'm going to reveal it in a second. I've been on holiday in a country, in a town that I would say is the Paris of the North. What? The Paris of the North? You're probably sitting there thinking, what am I talking about? Well, I'll give it away. I'm talking about Stockholm, Sweden. And for a bit of context, I used to live in Stockholm. I've married a Swedish woman, and I know Sweden and Stockholm very, very well, maybe even as well as I know Paris and France. And coming back here, as I sometimes do, the more often I've been coming back, the more I've been noticing that there are intriguing connections between France and Sweden. And so on this trip, I did a little bit of digging, a little bit of history searching, and I got a bunch of emails from listeners when I did a walk through the city of Stockholm, a live walk, telling me interesting tidbits. So I've been gathering them up, and I figured for this episode and this episode only, I'd be talking about how France influenced Sweden in a number of very surprising ways. Including language, the royal family. The royal family is probably the best bit. I'll probably start with that. But also how Sweden and the Vikings influenced France and how we see it today. So that's what this episode is going to be about. My hope for it is that you'll learn a few interesting things to tell your friends and maybe that you'll come to Stockholm one day because it really is worth the trip. Anyway, let's take it away. You're listening to The Earful Tower. I'm Oliver G. Let's do it. So there you have it. Seeming we're doing a little bit of a different episode today. I figured I'd start, as I just mentioned in the intro, with what I consider to be a pretty fascinating story about a pretty fascinating Frenchman who somehow became the King of Sweden about 200 years ago in probably one of the most baffling Wikipedia pages that you'd be likely to read today. If you, and you know, I'm going to link it below. I've read it, I've gone through it, I've read a little bit more. I'm going to give you the gist of it because I think it's a great story. And I'm not reading, this is my version of it. So if I get the dates wrong, you can send the emails into Wikipedia and not to me. But the story, get this, okay? So Sweden had a king who was very sick and he was on his deathbed. Turns out he'd had several kids, all of them had died in infancy. He even adopted a Danish prince who came over. He was to be the heir to the throne. He died as well. This seemed to be a bit of a theme. So the Swedes are going, well, our king's getting pretty old. We're probably going to need to replace him soon. What are we going to do? And bang, just like that, the king, Charles XIII, died. And they didn't know what to do. They had no one. So they're thinking, who do we get? Who do we get? The first thought was they try and, ring in a prince from somewhere else, like they tried to do with Denmark. Didn't really work. Everyone was a little bit afraid because there'd been quite a few wars going on. So you know what they did? They said, we need a soldier. And which soldier came up? None other than Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte, which if you're a Swede will probably be ringing some familiar bells. He was a general. He was close to Napoleon. Get this, not only was he close to Napoleon, he was married to Napoleon's previous fiancée. And this woman, Désirée, was soon to become the Queen of Sweden. So Sweden goes, yeah, we'll take Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, and we'll make him the King of Sweden. He'll come over here. He'll be the King of Sweden, the King of Norway, and he'll bring his French wife with him. So imagine this. This is 200 years ago, just over 200 years ago in 1810. And the Swedes go, yeah, we'd like you as our king. He goes, Napoleon, that alright with you if I go over and be the King of Sweden instead of working for France? And Napoleon has a little bit of think about it. He goes, yep, I don't mind if you go over there, as long as you promise to never take up arms against France. And Bernadotte goes, well, I'm not going to make that promise, because I'm meant to be the King of Sweden. My allegiance will be with the Swedes. And Napoleon was like, alright, go on then, I don't mind. And he let him go off. So what's interesting about that is that the king, the whole Swedish royal bloodline 200 years ago began with some French people. So that continued, he had a really strong influence on Sweden. If you go to the capital, Stockholm, and you see the castle, which is called Drottningholm, I'm not talking about the royal castle in the city, I mean the residence out in the suburbs, it's based on Versailles. It looks quite like it. It's the same kind of big, symmetrical gardens, beautiful. And he remained the king in Sweden until 1844. He changed his name at this point. He was Charles John, or as the Swedes probably call him, Charles Jon. And they found him one morning unconscious. And on his deathbed, this bit I'll read to you, on his deathbed he said, and I kind of agree with him here, he says, "Nobody has had a career in life like mine. I could perhaps have been able to agree to become Napoleon's ally, but when he attacked the country that had placed its fate in my hands, he could find in me no other than an opponent. The events that shook Europe and that gave her back her freedom are known. It is also known which part I played in that." Imagine that. Quite strong words on his deathbed. So the story, just the story of that love triangle between Napoleon and Bernadotte and Désirée is quite an interesting part of history, I suppose. And apparently, I'm reading here, it's been made into books and films that I've not seen, but one I'm going to check out, a film called Désirée from 1954 with Marlon Brando as Napoleon, Gene Simmons as Désirée, and Michael Rennie as Bernadotte. That's on my list of things to watch. So there you go, that's my quick version of the story of how Charles XIV, or Carl Jon, as the Swedes would call him, went from being a French general to the start of a long line of Swedish royalty. Fancy that. While we're talking about royals and discreet love affairs, I think it would be only unfair if I didn't mention one of my favourites. I like this story. It's a little bit earlier in time and it's reversal. This is a Swede going to France and causing a bit of mischief. But I like the story because there's so many what-ifs about it. In fact, there's a chance that none of this really went anywhere, but if you use your imagination like I am right now, then you'll know that there's something going on here. But have you ever heard about Axel von Fersen? Axel von Fersen, you might say, the younger, who was a Swedish count who popped over to France. So he's kicking around between 1755 and 1810. Swedish count, and if you want the full title for those playing at home, Marshal of the Realm of Sweden, a general of horse in the Swedish Royal Army, and he was down in France liaising with Queen Marie Antoinette. So what I like about this story is he went down to France, he was at Versailles, and everyone liked him. I think he features in some of those movies about Marie Antoinette, maybe the one with Kirsten Dunst. If not, irrelevant. And she takes a liking to him because he's so charming and handsome and fun. He disappears for 4 years, comes back, and the relationship blossomed. I'm talking, he gets into the inner circle of Marie Antoinette. They write all kinds of letters to each other where if you sort of interpret them one way, it's absolutely clear that they're lovers. If you're cold-hearted and have no imagination, they're just very good friends who think each other are quite good-looking. But other people who have written sort of biographies on Marie Antoinette suggested that it would have been almost impossible for anything to happen, considering she was always hanging around with other people. She was never alone, so it would have been very difficult, apparently. Hey, I wasn't there, but it would have been very difficult for her to sneak off with old Axel and get things moving in the Petit Trianon. But one thing is for sure when it comes to Marie Antoinette, there were rumours flying left, right, centre, up, down, and in every other direction as well. She was also meant to be the lover of a bunch of other people, the Duc d'Orléans and the Comte d'Artois, so who knows what was going on back there. But it's interesting to think that kind of before Sweden got a French king, that there was a Swedish count down there messing around in the affairs of Marie Antoinette. But anyway, enough about history. Another thing that I want to talk to you guys about that I think is very interesting. You guys who listen to the show know that I love language. Little language quirks, little oddities and intrigues. And one thing that I think is particularly interesting is how Swedish and French influenced each other a huge deal, the languages. So we'll start off by how, assuming most of you guys out there are probably French fans rather than Swedish fans, we can start off with how the French language was really influenced by Sweden and Scandinavia. And of course, this is because of the Vikings. So if you go back to the 800s, 900s, we're talking over 1,000 years ago when the Vikings were threatening Paris and they were getting into northern France, they were leaving behind them a lot of language. I mean, let's take the most obvious. Northern France, the region, Normandy, and that's essentially the Swedish word for, men of the north, which the Vikings were, Normen, as they'd say in Swedish. So what they left behind them were a lot of these words that especially had to do with things like, and this is kind of fun, they left behind a lot of words that the French used to describe things like boats or areas, a lot of things to do with kind of warfare and... So for example, there are a lot of places in Normandy. Apparently there are several hundred places in Normandy that have connections to the Vikings, like anything that ends in bec, like Quebec, which obviously is in Canada, but also in Normandy. That word B-E-C at the end of a word comes from bec, which means like a brook or a creek or a river or whatever. So anything that ends like that, and there's a lot of them. But also anything, here's a few examples I got right in front of me. So in northern France, you've got Osmond, which comes from Asmundur, Ketil, which is Kettil, Trude, Torvald, and Tostin, which comes from Torsten. So my pronunciation, I reckon it's alright, but it could be a little bit off. But it's the same thing, incidentally, in a lot of England. If you've ever been to England, if you live in England, my grandma lives up in sort of central England, and when I was going around the villages there, I was amazed at how strong the connection to Swedish language or Viking language was. Anytime that a village up there ends in by, that B is the Swedish word for village. So for example, there was a village they called it Arnsby, which is just Arn as B, or Arnie's village. And there are loads of them. Everything up there has got a B at the end of it. And so on and so on and so on. But here's the words about the boat, things like that we have in English, like starboard or stern or whatever. All those words in French come from Swedish. So I don't know most of these words in either languages, to be honest. But what I do know are words like the word for wave, which in French is vague, and which in Swedish is våg. And they say, in this article I was reading, it's in Swedish, but they say, if you pronounce Swedish like a Danish person, which kind of sounds like you got maybe meatballs in your mouth a little bit, then it sounds kind of French when you read these words, which I thought was pretty cool. And then lastly, they said that the very common French word jolie, which means pretty or sweet, comes from the Viking word jol, which is a midwinter festival when Christmas comes around, and the word for Christmas in Sweden is jul, J-U-L. Not so far from jolie at all. So that's pretty interesting, but what I thought was quite cool the other way around is how the French influenced the Swedish language. So there are a couple of words that I remember when I learned Swedish that I noticed were very similar to French. For example, an umbrella in French is parapluie. In Swedish it's parapluie. Words like sidewalk or footpath in French is trottoir, and in Swedish is trottoir. And then like a comfy armchair is a fauteuil in Swedish, or a fauteuil in French. It confuses my head to try to say them all, but what I found really cool was a real connection, was that a lot of the words had to do with things that we typically consider maybe a little bit French or Parisian nowadays, like the theatre or the opera, or as they say in French, théâtre, opéra, in Swedish, theater, opera. Anyway, the word for theatre, opera, revue, scene, all those words are very similar in English and French, but also Swedish, where they're called teater, opera, scene. The word for salon is salon, and the word in French for the curtains at a theatre is coulisses, but in Swedish it's kulisserna, so it's almost the same thing. Same with balcony, applaud, critique, all these words are very similar in all three languages. So there you go, pretty interesting. There's a pretty strong influence of French words in Swedish, but probably not as much as there's a strong influence of French words in English, where it's said that up to 60% of our language comes from the French. But there you go, a little bit of language trivia. Swedish, English and French all mixed together. Interesting, huh? Alright, look, that's enough about Sweden and France. It's probably quite clear to you that I like both of them. I just thought I'd share that with you from where I'm sitting right now in Sweden. Back in Paris this week, and I'll get back to the Paris news, and back to regular guests, including coming up, I've got Janet Hulstrand, as I pronounce it, or Hulstrand as she probably pronounces it, even though she has Swedish ancestry. She's got a new book that's out right now. We're going to be talking in an upcoming episode about Parisians and French people and you know, what makes them tick, what gets them going. More information about that very soon. I've also got Cara Black, the author, is going to be in the studio. We're going to be talking about how to get away. Now, let me preface this. She's a crime writer. She writes about crime in Paris, fictional crime stories. We're going to be talking about how to get away with a murder in Paris. All theoretical and hypothetical, don't worry, but that'll be pretty interesting. She's also her first book in the Amy Leduc series is the book club book for this month, so she'll be joining us in Paris, in person, for a live video at the end of the month talking about her book. And also, she's a fan of the show, I'm a fan of her. We're doing 3 things this month. The third is she's going to be in there for the Patreon supporters in the member group, $10 a month. If you want to watch me and her walk through the Marais and retrace the steps of her character, Amy Leduc, we'll be doing it, I think, at the end of this week, so on Friday. More info on that soon. If you don't know what I'm talking about, people who are members of this show get to see the live videos that I do. A few days ago, I was walking through central Stockholm with my wife, Lena, the Swedish Viking, pointing out exactly where you should visit if you ever make it to this beautiful Paris of the North, as I've started calling it. But a little bit of Gmail before I get on to a word from French today. This is the rare follow-up email from an email that I wrote last week. Well, an email that I read last week, I should say. Someone had written in, if I remember correctly, they were from Perth, Western Australia, the same city where I'm from, and they just wrote about how they like to listen, and I read that out on the show. And then, what do you know, Megan Jane Crust writes in. She says, I've just listened to the latest pod. I also look forward to each week, and I wish I'd known about it when I was in Paris last year. Anyway, and here's where it probably gets a bit more interesting, for you guys anyway. Anyway, I'm a listener in Oliver's hometown of Perth, and I've started learning French again, and I wondered how many other Perth earfuls there are, and if anyone was interested in a meetup to continue the discussion on all things Parisienne. That's pretty cool to know that there's... Firstly, I think it's pretty cool that she referred to herself as an earful. I like that. Secondly, I like to know that there's at least 2 Perth earfuls out there. Thirdly, if you guys want to meet up with Megan, or indeed, I can't remember the name of the person from last week, but her as well, maybe there'll be some little earful meetup, which I love. I already know that there's earful meetups in Melbourne and somewhere in America, but I love this idea. So if you guys ever meet up in your corners of the world to discuss all things French, and it started via the Eiffel Tower, send me an email, I'll read it on the show, and I want to encourage that because that brings a smile to my eyes and my mouth. But yeah, really good. Megan Jane Crust, she put it as a post on the Facebook page, which is kind of hard to find, I think. So if you're really desperate to find it, email me or look for that post. And if you're interested in finding other people, I don't know, put it in the comments on Facebook or Instagram, and hey, who knows, maybe it'll work. Anyway, that's it from Paris and Sweden. I think it's time to talk a little bit about French today. Alright, so once again, if you're new here, this has been a very different episode of the Eiffel Tower so far, but one thing that remains the same now as it has all year is that I talk a little bit about French today. Why? Because they're the sort of chief sponsor of this show. It's the Patreon supporters and French Today. What's French Today? It's audiobooks that help you learn French. Now, it starts basically right at the beginning. So if you're a beginner learning French, it's practically perfect for you. What happens? You buy the audiobooks, You repeat after Camille, she's the voice behind it all, but she's also a regular guest on this show, and she's thanks to her that I can speak decent French. But you do the audiobooks, and they work all the way from the beginning of French, your bonjours and everything, all the way to beyond my level, which I don't even dare dream what goes on in level 8 and beyond. But what I've been doing is I take little bits that I've been learning as I've been going through these audiobooks, and I share them with you, kind of partially to introduce you to something that you maybe didn't know, or something about the way of French life that you can learn through the language, or in the case today, things that you might actually find useful if you were to come to France. So with that in mind, I've noted 4 things today. 2 of them are kind of similar and say a lot about French, but I want to walk you through them. First is just a real straight out easy thing that you hear a lot, and you probably don't say a lot because it's kind of sounds counterintuitive. But it's kind of a familiar expression, and when you want to say, like, there's a fair amount of something, like, there's quite a lot of something going on, you can say there's pas mal de, which literally means not bad of. So, for example, are there a lot of animals at your farm? Yeah, there's not bad of sheep over there, is literal translation. Or pas mal de moutons. So I like that. It's weird, it's negative when not bad amount. Pas mal de. So there you go, there's something for you to potentially use. The next thing, I'll start with something that would be specifically useful to you if you're coming to Paris. You go into a restaurant, you order meat. The waiter will often, and this is really annoying, I think, for a lot of tourists or people who've just moved to Paris or France, is you're really good at ordering. You can say exactly what you want. You can order the drink, you can pay the bill, you order the steak, and all of a sudden they say some weird word that you never heard. They ask you how you want it cooked. So the way they usually say it is they just say la cuisson, which just means, how do you want it cooked? And you'll see it a lot. I've seen it before. It throws people, because even if you know what they mean, even from the context, he's asking how you want it cooked, it's hard to answer it without knowing these next words that I'm going to teach you. So the first one, you can just respond like this. You say à point, which means medium to medium rare, as in cooked thoroughly, as Camille writes here. Cooked thoroughly, but a bit of pink inside. The French, she always adds little bits about France and French culture and stuff. The French don't cook their meat much more than that. So if you want to fit in, order it à point. Otherwise, you can order it saignant, which is rare, cooked but still red and very juicy. That's the norm in France. Then there's bleu, as in blue, just seared. It could be a bit cool inside, she writes, and a lot of people like their meat this way in France. Me personally, I take it à point every time. À point, monsieur. But then she adds at the end of it, so these are all, this bit here is in from Study Guide 6. I'm sort of between 5 and 6 and jumping between them at the moment. Camille would probably say go through them individually, but I've got them all in front of me, and I felt like 6 today. And I've been on holiday, so I haven't been doing it every single day. Don't kill me, Camille. But this is interesting, right? She says, if you want your meat medium well done, as in no red at all, ask for très très cuit, as in very, very cooked. But I'll tell you something, and this isn't in the books, but this is what I've seen and what I've heard. You shouldn't do that. The French waiters or even the chefs can get disappointed that you're murdering the meat, which has already been murdered once. So you're not going to really win any fans, and they'll know that you're not from around here. Anyway, the last thing that I think is kind of fun is something I noticed, especially when I traveled around France on the honeymoon trip. The French love to use the word bon, or bonne, B-O-N or B-O-N-N-E. You will know it from bonjour or bon appétit or, bonne soirée. There's a lot of things they use it for, but what you might not have known is they use it for a lot more. So, for example, if you're about to sit down and eat, or if you're about to have a tasting, or tasting wine, or tasting meat, or who knows, whatever you want, they'll often wish you a bonne dégustation. Kind of like what you think bon appétit would be used for. They'll often say bonne dégustation, which just means, enjoy savoring this food. And in that same lesson, Camille had pointed out there's an expression where, and you hear this a lot in French too, where they'll say bonne continuation, as in good, I don't know the literal translation, but like enjoy what you're doing, enjoy the rest of what you're doing. Like the waiter might come along halfway through and say, Do you want anything else, or do you want any drinks or anything? You say, no thank you, and they'll say, bonne continuation. But what I really like about it is that when you're traveling around, like I said, you'll notice it all over the place, especially in restaurants and hotels. For example, you might check into a hotel. They'll take your name, they'll give you the room key, and as you go up to your room, what do you think they say? They don't say, have a nice stay or whatever. They wish you a nice, I don't know how you translate it, but a nice session getting comfortable in your room, and they'll say, bonne installation, which I quite liked. Good installation there, sir. And they'll also say, if you're going out for a walk afterwards, bon balade. All that is to say, learn French with French Today, and you'll be enjoying yourself much as I am. If you want to save 10% on all the audiobooks, a further 10% than any sales they might have on at this point in time, go to frenchtoday.com/earful5. The 5 is because we're in the month of May. If you're going to buy something in June, do 6. It'll automatically kick 10% off. You can get the audiobooks from beginner level right up to expert level, plus a lot of extra little bonuses in there, like secrets of French pronunciation, for example, and other drills and things to improve your own French. So, with that in mind, I'm going to be back in France the next time you hear me, and I've got a bunch of episodes planned. I've got a bunch of walk shows planned out on the streets live. So tell your friends. Thanks for listening, and wherever you are, whatever you're doing, I hope you're thinking about making a little earful club with your friends to talk about Paris. Let me know how it goes, and I'll see you next Monday. Au revoir.